I climbed up into an old coaling tower. A widow said, "That's the last place they'll think to look for me." Odette Hargrove had $9, a duffel bag with a set of hand tools she'd carried since her last steady job on a rail infrastructure maintenance crew, and a habit of checking any old coaling tower she passed for signs of continued use. A habit that had led her, more than once that year, to exactly the kind of forgotten structure that kept her sheltered for a few weeks at a stretch. She was 22 years old, laid off 8 months earlier, when the regional rail authority that employed her privatized its infrastructure maintenance division, eliminating her entire position in a single round of contract changes. She had been moving through rail towns ever since, taking whatever short-term work she could find. The privatization notice had come with barely 2 weeks' warning, and Odette had spent the 8 months since relearning, rail town by rail town, that her particular skill with concrete infrastructure and structural assessment mattered a great deal less to most temporary employers than whether she had a fixed address and a reference from the last 6 months. She had grown up around exactly this kind of infrastructure, her own father having maintained similar coaling and water towers for nearly 3 decades before her, and she had learned, riding along on his inspection routes as a child, to read a structure's condition with the particular patient attention such aging concrete demanded. She found the old coaling tower on a cool afternoon in early autumn, its tall concrete structure standing beside a disused rail spur, its interior access ladder rusted but intact. The tower itself rose considerably higher than most structures she'd inspected recently, its top disappearing into a slight autumn haze that made the climb feel, for a moment, almost like ascending into the sky itself. Odette climbed partway up to assess the structure's condition, understanding from years of exactly this kind of inspection work that a tower this age deserved careful evaluation before anyone trusted it as genuine shelter, testing each rung's stability before committing her full weight to it. She was still several rungs from the top when a voice, tense and urgent, called down from above. "Keep climbing quickly and stay quiet once you're up here, please." Odette climbed the remaining distance to find an elderly woman crouched in the tower's small maintenance platform, her whole posture rigid with fear, watching the ground below through a gap in the structure's aging concrete. "There are men searching my property right now," the woman whispered. "I saw their car arrive from my kitchen window and slipped out the back before they reached the door. This is the last place they'll think to look for me. I don't imagine you expected to climb into the middle of somebody else's emergency today." They watched together through the gap as 2 men methodically searched the farmhouse below, checking outbuildings, calling out a name that Odette assumed belonged to the woman beside her, their manner carrying a particular practiced aggression that struck Odette as considerably more threatening than any legitimate business visit would typically require. One of the men tried the farmhouse's own back door, finding it locked, and Odette watched the woman's whole body tense further at the sound of him testing the handle a second, more forceful time. "They've never actually tried the doors before," the woman whispered. "Today feels different, more urgent somehow. I don't know what's changed, but I don't like it." "Who are they?" Odette whispered. "They claim to represent the state's Inheritance Tax Enforcement Division," the woman said. "Name's Vesper Langley. My husband passed 4 months ago, and these men have been telling me I owe a substantial inheritance tax that must be paid immediately, in cash, or the state will seize this property. Today they've apparently decided a phone call and a letter weren't sufficiently persuasive." The men below eventually gave up their search, their voices carrying frustration as they returned to their car and drove away. And only once the sound of the engine had faded entirely did Vesper finally release the breath she'd apparently been holding through the entire encounter. "I'm sorry to have pulled you into this," Vesper said, her voice returning to something closer to normal volume now that the immediate danger had passed. I simply panicked when I saw their car, and this tower was the nearest place I could think to hide. I don't mind at all, Odette said. I used to work rail infrastructure myself, actually, before I lost my position. Tell me more about this inheritance tax situation. Something about it doesn't sound right to me. Over the following hour, sitting together in the tower's small platform, Vesper told Odette the fuller story of exactly what had brought genuine physical fear into her own home these past several weeks. The men had first contacted her by phone shortly after her husband's death, identifying themselves as state tax officials and informing her that a substantial inheritance tax was owed on the farm's assessed value, payable within 30 days, or the state would initiate seizure proceedings. Follow-up letters had arrived on official-looking letterhead, and the men's visits had grown increasingly aggressive as Vesper's own uncertainty and grief left her without the clarity to properly question their claims. The first call came exactly 9 days after Ezra's funeral. Vesper said, "I remember because I'd only just begun sleeping through the night again, and that phone call undid weeks of slowly settling grief in a single conversation. They spoke with such confidence, such official certainty, that I never once thought to question whether the entire call might be fabricated. They knew details about the farm, about Ezra's death. That struck me as genuinely official at the time," Vesper said. The assessed property value, the exact date of the funeral, even the name of the funeral home. I didn't think to question how they'd come by that information so quickly. I simply assumed a legitimate government office would naturally have access to exactly those kinds of records. I don't understand tax law well enough to know whether what they're claiming is legitimate," Vesper admitted. "My husband always handled anything involving the government directly. I've simply been terrified these past weeks that I'm going to lose this farm over a tax I don't understand and can't afford to pay." She wrapped her arms around herself, the particular posture of someone who had carried this specific fear largely alone for weeks before finally speaking it aloud to another person. "Have you actually contacted the state's tax office directly to verify any of this?" Odette asked. "I was afraid to," Vesper said. "The men warned me that contacting outside parties could complicate the process, make the state less willing to work with me on a payment arrangement. I understand now how that probably sounds, but at the time, frightened and grieving, it felt like reasonable advice rather than the manipulation I suspect it actually was. I think we should call the state's actual tax office directly today," Odette said. "I don't think legitimate government officials would ever discourage you from verifying a claim through the state's own official channels. That warning alone tells me considerably more about what's actually happening here than anything else you've described." They made the call from Vesper's own kitchen phone once they'd confirmed the men's car was genuinely gone, reaching a state tax office representative who listened to Vesper's account with growing concern of her own. The representative asked several pointed questions about the letter's specific language and the men's demand for cash payment, her tone shifting from routine professional courtesy to genuine alarm as Vesper's account continued. "Mrs. Langley, I need to tell you plainly that our office does not conduct in-person collection visits, and we do not demand cash payment for any tax obligation," the representative said. "What you're describing sounds like an inheritance tax scam that's unfortunately become common against recently widowed homeowners. I'm going to connect you with our fraud investigation unit immediately." Vesper's hands trembled visibly as she absorbed the confirmation. The particular disorientation of discovering weeks of genuine terror had been built entirely on a fabrication. "I nearly withdrew my savings to pay them," she admitted, once the call had ended. "I had an appointment scheduled at my bank for tomorrow morning." "I'm glad we made this call today, before that appointment," Odette said. "I don't think either of us fully understood how close this actually came." The state's fraud investigator, a methodical woman named Priscilla Hart, visited the farm the following day, reviewing the letters and documenting Vesper's account of the men's visits with evident professional concern. She examined each piece of correspondence carefully, noting details Vesper herself had never thought to question, the particular thoroughness of someone who had clearly investigated similar schemes before and understood exactly what evidence mattered most. "This matches a pattern we've been tracking across 3 counties," Hart told them. "Scammers researching recent obituaries, identifying elderly widows, and pressuring them with fabricated tax obligations before grief and uncertainty give way to the kind of clear thinking that would otherwise expose the fraud immediately. You owe absolutely nothing to this state beyond the ordinary property taxes you've presumably already been paying for years." "I don't understand how they knew to target me specifically," Vesper said. "Obituaries are public record, unfortunately, and property assessments are as well," Hart said. "These particular scammers appear to cross-reference both, identifying widows with property valuable enough to make the scam worthwhile, timing their first contact for exactly the vulnerable weeks immediately following a spouse's death, when grief makes careful scrutiny considerably harder to manage." "Did you happen to note the license plate on their vehicle?" Hart asked. "Even a partial number could considerably strengthen our investigation." "I did, actually," Odette said. "I wrote it down while we were watching from the tower, out of habit more than any particular plan." She produced the notebook where she jotted the number, and Hart's expression sharpened with genuine interest. "This is exactly the kind of detail that turns a difficult case into a solvable one," Hart said, copying the number carefully into her own file. "Most victims are too frightened in the moment to think of documentation. I don't think you fully understand yet how valuable that presence of mind actually was." She closed her notebook and studied both women a long moment. "I'd like your permission to use this case, anonymized appropriately, in the fraud prevention materials our office distributes to newly widowed homeowners going forward. Cases resolved this cleanly are rare enough to be worth sharing widely." Hart's investigation, aided by the license plate Odette had thought to note during the men's visit, led to the identification and arrest of the scheme's operators within the following month. Their prosecution, ultimately revealing they had successfully extracted payments from at least 6 other widows across the region before Vesper's case exposed the full pattern. Hart called Vesper personally once the arrests were confirmed, sharing details she felt Vesper deserved to know given her own crucial role in ending the scheme. "The other victims weren't as fortunate as you were," Hart said. "2 of them had already made partial payments before we identified the pattern. I want you to know that your willingness to verify their claims directly, rather than simply paying out of fear, is very likely the reason this scheme didn't continue running for considerably longer than it already had. I don't know how to describe what it feels like, after weeks of genuine terror, to learn the entire threat was manufactured from nothing." Vesper told Odette, once the investigation's outcome was confirmed, "I'd nearly emptied my own savings preparing to pay a tax that was never actually owed at all." "I think the fear itself was the actual weapon," Odette said. "The tax claim was simply the excuse. Men like that count on grief and uncertainty doing most of their work for them, long before anyone thinks to simply pick up a phone and verify the claim directly." Odette stayed on at the farm through that winter, and the ones that followed, the coaling tower that had first given her an afternoon's unexpected shelter becoming, gradually, something closer to a shared landmark than either of them had expected when a stranger first climbed into the middle of somebody else's emergency. She spent that first year helping Vesper manage the farm's own maintenance needs, work that had gone neglected during the frightened, uncertain weeks following her husband's death, and found herself, gradually, becoming the kind of steady presence Vesper's own late husband Ezra had once provided, without ever quite trying to replace him directly. Vesper, in turn, began reconnecting with her own community once the scam's resolution restored some measure of her earlier confidence, attending church gatherings and neighborhood events she'd withdrawn from during the worst of her fear. I stopped answering my own phone those weeks. Vesper admitted, one evening that winter, I told myself I was simply being cautious, but I think, looking back, I was also embarrassed, somehow, at having been frightened enough to believe them in the first place. It felt easier to withdraw entirely than to explain to friends and neighbors exactly what I'd nearly done, out of fear alone. Fear built on real threats and fear built on manufactured ones feel identical while you're living through them. Odette said, I don't think there's any shame in that, whatever the eventual truth turned out to be. Those men were considerably practiced at exactly this kind of manipulation. I don't think anyone facing it fresh, grieving and alone, would have fared much better than you did. My husband would have been glad to know somebody finally helped me see through what those men were actually doing. Vesper told Odette one evening, the two of them sitting together in the farmhouse kitchen. He always handled anything official between us, and I think losing him left me considerably more vulnerable to exactly this kind of manufactured authority than I'd ever have been if he were still here to simply ask the right questions himself. I think you'd have asked the right questions eventually, on your own, Odette said. I simply happened to be there to help you ask them a little sooner than you might have managed entirely alone. Odette wrote to her own father that winter, describing the coaling tower and the whole strange sequence of events that had led a routine structural assessment to become, in the end, exactly the kind of steady purpose she'd feared she might never find again after the privatization ended her own maintenance career. His reply came a few weeks later, brief but proud in the particular way Odette remembered him always being. Told you a good inspector's habit of checking every structure properly would eventually lead somewhere worth staying. Proud of you for thinking to note that license plate, when it mattered more than either of you understood at the time. Odette thought, some evenings that winter, about the 8 months of towns and privatization notices that had led her to a rusted ladder on a cool autumn afternoon, and understood, watching Vesper move through her own kitchen with a confidence that had barely existed the day they'd met, that she had found, at the end of that unsettled stretch, exactly the kind of purpose her own father had modeled decades before she was old enough to understand it. Not simply steady work, but the particular privilege of arriving, entirely by chance, on exactly the day a manufactured fear needed a clear-eyed stranger to finally see through it. She kept the notebook with the license plate number tucked into her own toolbox after that, a small private reminder of exactly how much a simple habit of documentation had ended up mattering. On the one afternoon, it counted more than either of them could have anticipated when she'd first started jotting it down out of nothing more than professional instinct. So here's the question worth sitting with tonight. How many recently widowed homeowners face manufactured threats specifically timed to exploit grief before clear thinking has the chance to return? And what does it take? A stranger climbing an old tower on exactly the right afternoon? One phone call to an actual official office? An investigator willing to trace a pattern across 3 counties? For a manufactured fear to finally be exposed as nothing at all? If this story stayed with you, subscribe to Ember and Rail, because there's always room by the fire for one more, and tell us in the comments where in the world you're watching from tonight.